Now, most importantly, though, in this whole system is the chemical control of respiration, right? Remember, you've got pH, PCO2, and PO2. When we talked about blood gases, that's pretty much what we talked about, right? And a little bicarbonate along the way. Well, this system, it needs to be aware of those factors and adjust respiration accordingly. Okay, so we have this kind of strange relationship between hydrogen ion and CO2 in the brain. Okay, so respiration is primarily controlled by hydrogen ion concentration. In other words, the DRG, that part of the brain, right, here's the inspiratory area, the DRG that's going to control respiration is most significantly affected by pH. All right? pH is going to make it change its output most. Now, where the complexity happens, and there's my thing in the way again. Where the complexity happens is because of the blood-brain barrier. Okay, that's BBB. The blood-brain barrier does do a pretty good job at restricting the flow of hydrogen ions from plasma to brain. This is a good thing, right? The brain is very sensitive to low pH, and the brain is the control center for everything else. So we need to protect the brain from acidosis as much as possible. Okay, so CO2 can very readily cross the blood-brain barrier. H plus cannot. Okay, that's the key. So it means that as your CO2 concentration in the plasma increases, because of our reaction CO2 and water, carbonic acid, and then bicarbonate H plus, it means that as CO2 increases, H plus near the DRG also increases, right? Because these two are related. So it makes this important effect, which I added this morning. This is always a sticking point. So H plus has the greatest direct effect on the DRG. But plasma, on the other side of the blood-brain barrier, plasma pH isn't directly connected to the pH around the DRG because of the blood-brain barrier, you see? So if a question were to ask you, the DRG is most affected by either pH or PCO2, the best answer is pH, right? Because that is the direct effect. Now, CO2 is going to affect that pH, which is going to affect the DRG. You see, so it's a two-step process. So changes in CO2 lead to changes in hydrogen ion concentration. That's what affects the DRG, all right? So, let's see. Yes. So H plus is the primary. CO2 concentration, okay, because it affects H plus, all right? And then, to a much less extent, oxygen concentration. So read that last one again. Much less extent, oxygen concentration. We do not breathe for oxygen. We breathe to get rid of H pluses, really, for the most part, right? All right, so CO2 and hydrogen ions, so pH, the effect there is through this chemosensitive area under the ventral side of the medulla. So that's the hot zone, so to speak. That is where your current respiratory status is directly assessed. Now, there are also chemoreceptors in other parts of the body which send signals to the brain. Okay, we're going to talk about those in a minute. This is direct effect. There's no nervous system involved outside of these neurons right here. All right? So, let's see. We did that one. Direct effect. Plasma pH is limited. I think I covered all that. Okay, so the last point is this bullet. So, changes in respiration as a result of changes in PCO2 or pH are powerful and rapid at first, but we accommodate for it. In other words, if your PCO2 stays high for days and days, okay, eventually the DRG adapts to the higher level. All right, this is how our COPD patients, our emphysema patients, can walk around with PCO2s of 85 or 90, right? Number one, their kidneys are doing their compensation, okay? But there is also an accommodation or a tolerance at the DRG for high PCO2s that go on over a long time. So we get a big effect at first, but over long periods of time, that effect goes away. To such an extent that a patient who has a high PCO2 for a very long time will simply not change their respiratory rate in response to changes in PCO2. So they just lose that ability. So what makes them breathe? Oxygen, right? They sort of stop worrying, their brain stops looking at PCO2, and they only breathe more when they need more oxygen. So in those patients, if we are treating them and we put a big fancy non-rebreather mask on them and we make their O2 concentration very, very high, they stop breathing, right? Because they don't have PCO2 that they're breathing for, and we just gave them all the oxygen they could hope for, so they no longer have a stimulus to breathe. So it's one of those things to remember. If you put oxygen on a patient and they stop breathing, take the oxygen off the patient and then assess their PCO2 and what's wrong with their respiratory system.